Hello and welcome to the Digital Consortium and our series on architecture and philosophy. Today, I'm delighted to be able to welcome back two long-standing friends and colleagues, Andrej Radman and Stavros Kousoulas from TU Delft. I would say myself that TU Delft is probably the hot spot for architectural theory these days. There's so much interesting work coming out of there. And today we're going to be looking at Leibniz, an extraordinary figure, a polymath who not only was the person who independently invented calculus, but also is behind, as a philosopher, behind the whole tradition of German idealism. I know nothing about Leibniz. I'm going to be all ears today to go and find out from Stavros and Andre. So, Andre and Stavros, welcome. It's fantastic to have you back.
Thank you,
Thank
Neil.
you so much. It's really a pleasure. So we've decided that I go first and Stavros, and then we break into the usual Q&A
Yes.
moment. That's fine.
Enjoy, Andrej.
Thank you. Thanks. So before I do start, let me thank Neil and Michael and the entire team of the Digital Futures for the opportunity to contribute yet again to this important Digital Futures series on what architecture can learn from philosophy. Once again, those who watch Saturday Night Live, which celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, they may be familiar with the custom that multiple hosts, such as ourselves, get to wear a special smoking jacket with a coat of arms printed on its pocket, bearing the number of postings. In our case, it would be 5, as we have already done Gilbert Simondon, Henry Bergson, Raymond Rouyer, and most recently Bernard Stiegler. With Gottfried Leibniz, we continue the somewhat unfortunate series featuring male European dead people. Yet, we now earn a number 5 on our DF pocket. You will be happy to know that Leibniz was the topic of our last year's advanced PhD seminar at TU Delft with the title Architecture with a Twist, which was effectively a close reading of Deleuze's Fold. So that is to say that we speak with some degree of confidence, although it's a very unorthodox Leibniz that we will get this afternoon. Leibniz is also a great immanence, and this is a moment of product placement, in Stavros's and my upcoming book, Architectures of Relations, with the Batesonian subtitle Environment plus Organism, which will be published by Routledge, hopefully later this year. So here we go. A word on the title of the presentation, Monadism and Transmonadism. So monadology, just to remind ourselves, is Leibniz's most famous philosophical work in which he presents his metaphysical system through the concept of monads. It was written relatively late in his life, in 1714. So briefly, monads are simple, indivisible, and incorporeal substances that make up all reality. They have no physical or corporeal interaction with one another, but are instead synchronized by God in a harmonious, pre-established order. So each monad expresses the entire universe, albeit from its own unique perspective or point of view. And I believe Stavros' talk bears a point of view in the title itself. So the internal development of monads follows the so-called principle of sufficient reason rather than external forces. So in Aristotelian terms, the efficient causality of bodies is complemented by the final causality of souls, which makes Leibniz, in the words of Norbert Wiener, patron saint of cybernetics, insofar that he has managed to reconcile organicism and mechanicism. With the neologism transmonadism, Felix Guattari is reworking the idea of the monad into a process-based fluid ontology, where the logic of continuity and the logic of discreteness are also reconciled. Most recently, I just want to flag a work by Richard Halpern, book from 2023, Leibnizing, with the subtitle "A Philosopher in Motion." So back to Felix Guattari himself, from his book Kousoulas, the qualitative metaphysical concept of irreversible transmonadism, and I quote now, through the effect of retroactivity, crystallizes within the primitive chaotic soup spatial coordinates, temporal causalities, energy levels, possibilities for meeting of complexions, a whole ontological sexuality composed by axiological bifurcations and mutations, unquote. So following Albert North Whitehead's advocacy of displacing essences by events, we get retroactivity, which seems to be another word for recursivity, whereby past and future shape each other dynamically, that is to say, non-chronologically, following the Stoic formula from cause to effect to quasi-cause. Transmonadism is thus challenging both Newtonian physics, with its absolute space and mechanicism, and Cartesian metaphysics, with its ontological iron curtain between the body and the mind, res extensa and res cogitans. Insofar as the primitive chaotic soup, as Guattari calls it, knows no a priori space and time, and it is energized by contingent encounters, which he refers to as the ontological sexuality, meaning a constantly mutating field of difference and connection structured by value-based, that is to say, axiological choices and bifurcations, which this is what Nietzsche would call the unlimited finity, or what Deleuze calls the superfold. So here, perhaps we could use the title of the Douglas Hofstadter's, it's about the strange loop. So perhaps instead of evolution, it would be more appropriate to refer to this as involution, the strange loop, from the book on Gödel, Escher, and Bach. So things are no longer understood in terms of a limited essence defined by a number of properties through which a thing can be recognized and represented apodictically. Instead, things are determined through an infinity of reasons, quasi-causes that express themselves through individuation. So put simply, and Robin Evans, the architect, has warned architects long time ago that space and time are not a priori, as in Kant. To bring it down from the admittedly high register of abstraction, transmonadism will hopefully provide an answer to the architectural question of why zebras have stripes. Let's start with the point of view. According to Deleuze, the last living polymath, namely Gottfried Leibniz, taught us that it is not the subject that has a point of view, but the other way around, so that the subject is secondary to the point of view. However, such perspectivism is not to be confused with relativism. To paraphrase the anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, different life forms do not see the same world in different ways. Rather, they see different worlds in the same way. One can thus generalize monadology to encompass zoology and biology at large. In order to substantiate the claim, I'd like to pose a seemingly naive, yet deeply philosophical question in the tradition of Gregory Bateson's metalogues. Namely, why do zebras have stripes? What I will try to demonstrate is that monads, as points of view, are not separated from other bodies. They are quite literally in them to a certain degree, as we will see, of course. The cliché of stripes with the zebra as camouflage against predators is to be dismissed on account of what Maxine Sheets Johnston refers to as the kinesthetic and multimodal nature of perception. A body is not perceived on static properties such as stripes. According to my hero, the ecological psychologist J.J. Gibson, it is perceived as an invariant embedded in change. But if the stripes of zebra are not meant to confuse lions and hyenas, how did they individuate and why? The answer is as delightful as it is surprising. It actually involves a point of view of a completely different, quote-unquote, companion species, so much smaller than zebras or lions or hyenas to be easily overlooked. We are referring to the fly. These insects are notoriously dangerous to mammals because they carry parasites. Flies are not the cause, but the because, the reason, the sufficient reason of the stripes that bear a strong fly repellent capacity. This particular teleodynamism, which is not homeostatic, between the predator and the prey can be easily put to test. And I'm using this the teleodynamism from neuroanthropologist Terence Deacon. You might want to come back to it in the Q&A. So a simple experiment that you see here on the screen of counting the number of flies trapped by either the monochrome or the striped Umwelt parodies. So these Umwelt parodies are barrels, and I'm using here a term by Alfred Gell. It demonstrates that the flies are overwhelmingly drawn to the monochrome Umwelt parodies. The Leibnizian scholar Pauline Femister pushes Leibniz into the ecological camp. And I'm drawing on her work on Leibniz and the environment from 2016, and I quote directly from her. Competing and non-competing desires, akin to competing motions and resistance of bodies, may be conceived as adding a qualitative dimension to a quantitative space, a value dimension that is founded upon the perceptual and appetitive relational qualities belonging to the living things that make up the universe of Leibniz, the Leibnizian universe. So back to the fly. According to yet another contemporary Leibnizian, Thibaut de Meyer, the flies are thus, to speak loosely, part and parcel of the zebra's body. If the flies perceived differently, the zebra stripes, zebras as we know them, wouldn't exist. In the dynamics of evolution, the point of view of the fly entered into the body of the zebra. It is a real involution. And here we are back to the Leibnizian proposition that the monad enters into the composites, unquote. So the author of this quote, de Meyer, does not dwell on the actual cause of this repulsion that I will try to attempt to explain below, but makes a much more substantial point. The monadological proposition is an invitation, according to him, to think relationally, that is to say, ecologically. So monads may have no extension, but that does not make them any less real. They are incorporeal yet real. That might sound familiar to some of the Deleuzian readers. When Leibniz speaks of composites, he means material bodies, hence the mutual, albeit asymmetrical reciprocity of the actual corporeal and the virtual incorporeal. According to Leibniz, each monad perceives, though in varying degrees of clarity, all the other monads. So each monad perceives everything, but in different degrees. Against all odds, it turns out that, for example, the lion's point of view turns out to be less significant for the zebra than that of the fly, regardless of their massive difference in size. And I did touch on this in the lecture on Rouyer towards the end. If value is defined as that which motivates or demotivates action, then transmonadism qualifies as eco-axiology per excellence. This is my neologism, eco-axiology. The significance of the non-ecological appetitions was not lost on Deleuze and Guattari. By the way, the term appetition derives, just to remind ourselves, from the Latin ad petere, from ad, toward, and petere, to seek, aim at, or move towards. So now we go to 1000 Plato quote by Deleuze and Guattari. As a general rule, the problem of relationship between parts and the whole continues to be rather awkwardly formulated by classical mechanicism and vitalism. like, so long as the whole is considered as totality derived from the parts, or as an original totality from which the parts emanate, or alternatively as a dialectical totalization. Neither mechanicism nor vitalism has really understood the nature of desiring machines, unquote. So the primary of desire as a positive, pre-human and pre-organic force, and not as a Lacanian luck, can be regarded as the very source of the doctrine of perspectivism. This explains Friedrich Nietzsche's famous but often misinterpreted dictum that there are no facts, only interpretation, for those who separate facts from values. What is almost always overlooked is that for Nietzsche, it is not our egos that are perspectival, but our drives. And in the words of the Deleuzian scholar Dan Smith, here we go, it is not so much that I have a different perspective on the world than you. It is rather that each of us has multiple perspectives on the world because of the multiplicity of our drives that are often contradictory among themselves. Moreover, these drives are in constant struggle or combat with each other. My drive to smoke and get my nicotine rush is in combat with but also coexistent with my drive to quit. This is when Nietzsche first developed his concept of the will to power at the level of the drives. Every drive is a kind of lust to rule, he writes. Each one has its perspective that it would like to compel all the other drives to accept as a norm, unquote. Consequently, to embrace the radical perspectivism is to renounce the priority of identity and the phenomenological I. As we have seen, the subject is derivative of the point of view. And this is what Claire Colebrook's, how she puts it. She says, subjects are effects of affects. And of course, affects here are defined as the capacities to affect and be affected, as we see with zebra fly involution. This means that there is a way to understand the nature of the world without reducing it to judgment. By contrast to Immanuel Kant, for whom ideas are regulative concepts, for Deleuze and Guattari, they are no longer to be understood in terms of propositions, but in terms of problems. We are born of the problem nature poses. As the Simondonian scholar Muriel Combs explains in Log from 2020, if a new individuation can happen to the already individuated, it is according to a pre-individual part, this is where the drives, the desire is, that it contains. And it will function as a starting point for a newly arriving problem, unquote. So the problem could be said to fuel existence. This reversal of the reversed ontology brings forth the importance of Gilbert Simondon's concept of alagmatics. So very briefly, etymologically, the Greek term alagma is related to vicissitude, transmutation, but it also refers to that which can be given or taken in exchange. And we've seen one of these exchanges with the zebra fly dynamics. The alagmatic is thus concerned with the changes of state or the relation exterior to its terms, a reversal that many find puzzling. According to Deleuze, this exteriority of relations is not a principle, but it is a vital protest against principles. After all, empiricists or pluralists have no principles. They rely on experimenting or experiencing, which are, of course, synonymous terms in French. So the alagmatic theory thus breaks the deadlock between the analytical approach of mechanicism, which assumes that a whole is reducible to the sum of its parts, and the analogical approach of organicism or vitalism, where the whole is somehow primordial. By binding sense and to sensibility, alagmatics allows for grasping the unity, which is not based on totality. Put bluntly, without embodiment, there would be no sense. And of course, sense in French designates, means direction. Sense is thus never ready-made, never given. It needs to be transmodally produced, and this entails our becoming the quasi-cause of what is produced within us. This is, I think, what Eric Hall refers to as the virtual ecology. Leibniz's example of the incommensurability of the sea and its waves is most revealing. I quote. This is a quote from New Essays of Human Understanding. I like to use the example of the roaring noise of the sea, which impresses itself on us when we are standing on the shore. Everybody's been there, so this is something that we can, understand. To hear this noise as we do, we must hear the parts which make up this whole, the roar itself. That is the noise of each wave, are the parts. Although each of these little noises makes itself known only when combined confusedly with all the others, and would not be noticed if the wave which made it were by itself, unquote. As I said, Deleuze interprets this passage as from Leibniz's New Essays of Human Understanding as presenting two languages in his difference and repetition. So, I quote Deleuze now. On the one hand, there is a roaring of the sea. This is the first language of the clear confused. I highlighted the term. It is clear insofar as one is able to recognize the roar of the sea as a whole, but it is also confused insofar as comprehending the sea as an object is dependent upon not taking account of the elements, the waves, that jointly determine it as such. On the other hand, we have the second language of the distinct obscure, also highlighted, the language of the waves themselves. The waves are perfectly perceived distinctly thanks to the differential relations that make up their noise, but they are also perceived obscurely because the focus on particular relations precludes the white noise of the sea from being comprehended as a whole. End quote. So, in contrast to Descartes' notion of clear and distinct ideas, for Deleuze, the clear is confused by itself insofar as it is clear. It is this discrepancy between the two languages that makes it possible to map the conditions of the real and not merely possible experience without committing to the fallacy of tracing and falling into a banal reiteration of structure of actuality, or what Whitehead refers to as the fallacy of simple location, where nature is, and I quote him directly, composed of permanent things, namely bits of matter moving about in space which otherwise is empty, end quote. The order is not imposed on an undifferentiated world. Sense is but the result of bodies and their encounters and expression of relations. As a condition of real experience, sense thus cannot be wider than the experience itself, as would be the case if it were a condition of possible experience, also known as categories. As Deleuze put it beautifully, categories are like baggy clothes, much too big, that they fit everybody and everyone. The principle of sense is therefore plastic and perspectival, as it changes with the changing experience. And this is the way to escape the overcoat, to speak with Brian Holmes, his wonderful essay bearing the same title, Escaping the Overcoat. So thinking does not go from proposition to proposition, but rather a genuine noesis is only made possible by tapping into the non-propositional field of problems that engender propositions. So I'd like to claim that there is a fallacy that is perhaps even worse than that of hypostatization. Hypostatization famously is where the abstract is mistaken for the concrete. You know, when you say the market and then somehow assume that you're pointing to something that is concrete. Simondon's theory of genetic operations, complementary to the theory of generic structures, as elaborated by the sciences, becomes indispensable antidote for the pernicious retroactive hypostatization. So, in parallel to hypostatization, we have this problem of retroactive hypostatization, where concrete now is mistaken for the abstract, so the other way around. Deleuze's caveat is as timely as ever. The opposite of the concrete is not the abstract, but the discrete. When sailors wear T-shirts with stripes, they do not mimic zebras. They become zebras, operationally and thus transmonadically. The difference in the degree of sunlight absorption and reflection, as you see here in this diagram, between the adjacent light and dark stripes generates a particular airflow pattern that ventilates the surface. My conjecture is that this induced turbulence also makes it difficult for flies to land on the surface of the skin, which is why they prefer a monochrome Umwelt. This is how zebras repel flies and how sailors keep their temperature down. It has also been attempted in architecture, cooling down of facades that have the zebra pattern. So according to Deleuze and Guattari, a style is not an individual psychological creation, but an assemblage of enunciation. It is the question of alloplastic mannerism. In the words of Deleuze-Guattari, again from 1,000 Platforms, I quote, "We think the material or machinic aspect of an assemblage relates not to the production of goods, but rather to a precise state of intermingling of bodies in society, including all the attractions and repulsions, sympathies and antipathies, alternations, amalgamations, penetrations, and expansions that affect bodies of all kinds in their relations to one another. Even technology makes the mistake of considering tools in isolation. Tools exist only in relation to the interminglings they make possible or that makes them possible." And this is now an example of what Rosi Braidotti would call the geo-bio-techno assemblage or geozoe techno assemblage, where we have the geological, the biological, and the technological working together. So this is I quote Deleuze and Guattari. The stirrup entails a new man-horse symbiosis that at the same time entails new weapons and instruments. Tools are inseparable from symbiosis or amalgamations, defining nature society mechanistic assemblages. And here the assemblages, I've recently heard the translator of 1,000 Platos, Masumi, saying that he now regrets, he says instead of assemblages, in French it would be agencement. He said, I should have called it agencing. It would have been clear that it's not a thing, it's a process. So they presuppose a social machine that selects them and takes them into its phylum. End quote. So it is thus technicities that sympoetically, to use this famous Donna Haraway's term, construct and are constructed by the alloplastic strata. And of course, sympoiesis literally means making with. Simply put, technicity deals with how humans relate to transform their environments through technology and how these very relations transform all of them in turn. Back to geo-bio-techno assemblage. And here I allow for a little moment of product placement because my colleague Stavros wouldn't do it himself. He's too humble. He has published a beautiful work on this topic in 2023, Architectural Technicities, with the subtitle, A Foray into Larval Space. So I'll continue. By giving primacy to experience and thus opposing causal determinism, radical perspectivism that I've been describing so far offers a compelling response to the question of why is it that biosphere and technosphere need to be thought always must not be thought in isolation. So biosphere and technosphere must not be taught in isolation, as Yukhui rightly insists. With technodiversity, we cannot hope to maintain biodiversity. But most crucially, it seems to me that technodiversity and biodiversity are the real conditions sine qua non of new diversity, the diversity of minds. Back to the idea of cultural industry of Adorno and Horkheimer. We need to cherish and maintain and make it possible to sustain the technodiversity and biodiversity in order to fashion new diversity of minds. While matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed, which is of course stipulated by the first law of thermodynamics, the architectural manners as modes of existence are virtually unlimited because they relate to the second law of thermodynamics, which has the arrow of time. Mnemotechnology, the technology of producing memory and retaining memory, and including all its guises. And here I mean really in the broadest sense of the term, including the epigenetics such as language and its sedimentation, or epiphylogenetics such as architecture, expands inevitably the realm of sensibility, as we have learned from Stigler. The auto-affectivity or maybe what Raymond Rouyer calls self-enjoyment, brought about by technicities, in the artificial sense, goes under the name of Baldwin evolution, or evolution by epigenetic means, or evolution by means other than life in Bernard Stiegler's terms. So the affordances of the environment as enabling constraints are thus both natural and artificial, and every shade in between. As the Gibsonian psychologist John Pickering explains, here comes his quote: "Matter is sensate, and it is primordial intentionality, and this primordial intentionality, this mind stuff, has been concentrated into autopoietic systems which preserve and diversify themselves through mutual semiotic evolution, modifying the environment in the process. The human environment thus becomes a special case, since it is largely a human creation from which the unique reflexivity of human experience emerges." Unquote. Transmonadism, however, compels us to correct Pickering, and instead of autopoiesis, think in terms of what Guattari would call heterogenesis, and also intentionality with EN, rather than instead of intentionality. And this is intentionality as it originates in the subject, and this is something that Deacon takes issue with his concept of intentionality. As Alicia Poirero argues in her book, Context Changes Everything, it is precisely constraints that create coherence, and not the subject. In her recent follow-up, it was published last year, titled Why Context Matters, Poirero offers a following cautionary note. I quote directly from her. When relevant biological and social constraints are set aside, whether because of the received atomistic ontology, that's to say substantialism, or modernity's understanding of causality as exclusively energetic transfer, which is close to mechanicism, then context plays no role in grounding moral reasoning by providing evidence in favor of or against one alternative over another. Sometimes a socio-cultural context can be ignored with no repercussions, and she gives an example like Galileo's dismissing friction when studying gravity. At other times, it takes effort or willful ignorance, as she says, to set aside clear-cut evidence that social constraints actively shape an individual's ideals, opinions, and beliefs, and conversely, that the individual actions of residents, when aligned, can qualitatively change the culture's possibility landscape, including its moral landscape, unquote. So what humans achieve through accumulation and improvement of cultural artifacts and practices could be said, is not short of the ultimate trick, magic trick of bootstrapping. That is to say that techne and mind are symbiotic and mutually enhancing. Yet, we should beware of the ridiculous cosmic evolutionism, as Deleuze and Guattari say, that puts the humanity, as it were, at the pinnacle of evolution. In other words, this is by no means an argument in favor of human exceptionalism, but a viable account of what Catherine Yusuf calls anthropogenesis, which is different from the genesis of quote-unquote animal cultures. I want to insist on this and a little bit on that before we continue. For example, and this is from 1,000 Platos, a bee that has seen a food source, like this one on the slide, can communicate the message to the bees that did not see it. But a bee that has not seen it cannot transmit the message to others that did not see it. According to Deleuze and Guattari, language does not go from a first party to a second party, so from the one who has seen to one who has not, but necessarily goes from a second party to a third party, neither of whom has seen. This is the epigenetic moment. It is in this sense that language is the transmission of the word as order word, and not the communication as a sign of information. Put simply, language is a map and not a tracing. It renders visible rather than rendering the visible, in Paul Klee's terms. Unsurprisingly, then, the ability of primates to produce artifacts could not stop the stagnation of quote-unquote animal cultures, because their production is neither cumulative nor detachable enough, not epi enough, to integrate discontinuous successive discoveries as the precondition of the convivial trans-individuation that produces epochs. The Simondonian concept of trans-individuation cannot be grasped based on either the fully individuated I, the liberal individual, in charge of their own destiny, or the inter-individuated we, we. It designates the process of co-individuation within a pre-individuated milieu in which both the I and the we get mutually determined. The becoming of both the individual and the collective is thus facilitated by depositing the greatest degree of pre-individual potential. As Simondon's disciple, Bernard Stiegler, surmised, trans-individuation is key to understanding all social transformation. And also crucially for us here in this lecture, the way of addressing architectural education, given the Simondonian famous formula that the knowledge of individuation equals the individuation of knowledge. All this calls for a radical rethinking of causality, as Sarah Ahmed puts it in her book. What we do affects what we can do. It also calls for the rethinking of causal efficacy of culture, insofar as it may be said to include everything we don't have to do, paradoxically. As Brian Eno argues in his book, A Year with Swollen Appendices, and I quote, "We have to eat, but we don't have to have cuisines. We have to cover ourselves against the weather, but we don't have to be so concerned as we are about whether we put on Levi's or Yves Saint Laurent or Breton stripe. We have to move, but we don't have to dance," unquote. So Eno calls the have-tos activities as functional and the non-have-tos as stylistic. Earlier, I referred to this as the capacity to make epochs, because animals have no epochs. They always stay the same in spite of their social bodies. The first thing is to note is that the whole bundle of stylistic activities is exactly what we would describe as culture. And this resonates strongly with those of us in the business of niche construction, who happily joined the anthropologist Vicky Kirby in asking, what if culture was nature all along? So, I'm approaching very last few sentences. So if we approach our being in terms of transmonadism, as I've been trying to argue, as composed through affective encounters, we will have to regard difference as constitutive of rather than opposed to identity. As Stephen Zebke underscored recently, real conditions of experience change along with what they condition, and their eternal return, and he uses this tongue-in-cheek, continually produces new sensations and new concepts. Those accustomed to representational thought, where difference is subordinated to identity and movement to stasis, find this ratcheting argument counterintuitive. Yet, the whole new transcendence within the heart of immanence opens up once we learn that the whole is not of the parts, but alongside them. That transcendental empiricism, foreshadowed by Leibniz, is not an oxymoron. Well over 2 centuries before radical pragmaticism, he proposed a way of reconciling the analog and the digital, the existential realm and the essential or the conceptual. And with these words, I hand it over to my colleague and friend Stavros, and I thank you for your attention for now.
Thank you, Andrej.
Thank you.
I'm on my right the way you see me, but also that's nice because it links to the point of view discussion. So I'll go straight there, right? Okay, I'll go straight into it.
Thanks.
Let me set up a bit and I start. Yeah. You see the screen, right? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, good. One more second because I need to set up something else. Yes. Okay. So I get going. Making a point, as you can see, title here. And it has to do with, it in a way, it continues just where Andrej left it, but also picks it up just where Andrej began. So it kind of stands both after and before the lecture by Andrej. And besides the point of view, it's also a discussion that in the same vein that Andrej opened up, picks up on intelligence, and in a way also on architectural intelligence included. And when we speak about intelligence, I can start with a very straightforward claim, basically being that intelligence is the capacity to differentiate between the singular, which is very remarkable, and the ordinary, which is the trivial. And intelligence in that sense is not just being able to optimize things. It's not about giving the right solution. So when we speak about the opposite of intelligence, which in most colloquial cases is stupidity, and in that sense, in the lecture of Bergson from a couple of years ago, we were speaking precisely about that. Intelligence can be defined as the capacity to determine a problem. Stupidity can be defined as the incapacity to properly determine a problem. The very close synonym to stupidity, idiocy, by definition prevents us from seeing beyond our interests and beyond ready-made solutions. And in that sense, it blocks all forms of environmental awareness, as well as the possibility of what Andrej closed his lecture with, the possibility of trans-individuation, to live and transform collectively. So one more straightforward claim is that to be intelligent, like a zebra is intelligent in its own way, one needs to embrace immanence and not transcendence. On that lecture of Bergson here on this channel from a few years ago, we went in more detail on that, but in short, to embrace immanence, it means to think and to become with the world, rather than supposedly outside and above it. So no bird, God, or any other heavenly figure's point of view, but rather a point of view that is in this world and of this world. And that's exactly why we will always need Leibniz. That's why every day we should start our morning rituals by a small thank you to him, because he offered us the ways of thinking that we can understand the value of a point of view. So when we refer to immanence, and in order to end up to Leibniz soon, but when we refer to immanence, we are speaking about a peculiar philosophical trajectory that includes figures like the Stoics, to Giordano Bruno, Spinoza, Nietzsche, and in any case, immanent ways of thinking want to prioritize the event in favor of the being that undergoes the event. So in immanent ways of thinking, the subject is not undergoing anything, it does not exist in advance, but the subject is produced by what happens to it, by the event. So for these figures, they actually propose, and this is Whitehead who coined the term, that we should not call the subject, we should call the superject. In that same spirit of the superject being produced by the event, the object, says this way of thinking, this immanent way of thinking, is also produced by the event, and it does not exist in advance. So it follows the object. It follows a curvature of transformation. It follows a line of individuation. It becomes an objectile. In this couple, superject-objectile, which is produced by events, it is also what replaces the fixed subject-object binary, and we owe this coupling to a very unorthodox reading of Leibniz, the greatest polymath of all times, as he engaged in this reading by another polymath figure, which is Gilles Deleuze, and his book on him, The Fold, is the book of Deleuze on Leibniz. So in the way that Deleuze understands Leibniz, there is a crucial point that manages to introduce a very radical and much needed perspective on how can we understand intelligence, including architectural intelligence. So with Leibniz, the rational reasoning slowly transforms to the relational, and it therefore regains the original meaning that it had from Latin, because in Latin we speak about ratio. And in speaking about ratio, and that's the famous variety of reasons, ratios, that Leibniz developed, ratio essendi, existendi, cognoscendi, fiendi, what we are actually speaking about through Leibniz is not principles, but thinking that operates relationality. For Leibniz, ratio is not translated directly to reason, but it's translated in the original meaning of it, which is relations. So we are speaking about the logics of relations of identity, relations of existence, relations of knowing, relations of continuity. So Leibniz is not a rational figure in the sense we use the term rationalism now. It's a relational figure in the sense that the term ratio was used in his time. With him, with Leibniz, the core concerns that he has in his metaphysics are shifting from questions of being, not being the ones that are the most pressing, but rather to questions of having. For Leibniz, to have is more important than to be. So in that same line that prioritizes the relational event, one should no longer ask what is it to be intelligent, but actually what it means to have intelligence, to possess intelligence, to involve and be involved in relations that can amplify or diminish your acquired and therefore always contingent intelligence. So in that line of thinking, Leibniz develops his so-called predicates. His predicates are not nouns, statements, objects regarding a subject, but actually are verbs, possessions, havings, let's say, objectiles that form a superject. So in his predicates, he's trying to figure out what sort of possessions can allow for what sort of actions that can eventually allow for what sort of transformations in objectiles that can produce a superject, that can produce each one of us. So he will add, Deleuze playing with Leibniz, will add that when the object becomes an objectile, then it encounters a group in transformation, and when the subject becomes a superject, then it becomes a point of view. These are the connections with Andrej's zebra lecture, which are going to be throughout my talk, obviously. So when we speak about the point of view, we can provide, and Andrej did it already, but we can mention it once again, we can provide a very quick definition, which according to Deleuze is that the point of view subsumes a series of transformations through which the transforming object, the objectile, passes. At this point, his monadism, the monadism of Leibniz, encounters nomadism, encounters mobility. The nomadic subject consumes and consummates each of the states through which it passes and is born in each one of them anew, again. So if this feeling is mine, that's what possession stands for. If this feeling is mine, then there must be also something I can call me. Following his radical reading of Leibniz, as well as all the injections that come from all his favorites like Whitehead, Deleuze will claim that a superject is the thing that envelops, implicates, complicates, and explicates, or in one word, folds, objectiles. So in an even quicker definition of a superject is that which folds variable curvatures. According to Deleuze, Leibniz is trying to confuse us here on purpose, because yes, the superject and the point of view are one and the same thing simultaneously, but he's quick to add that the point of view is actually the modality of a subject. The point of view is its inseparable mode, but it is not the point of view that defines the subject. In an agreement with a metaphysics that moves beyond being and moves to having, Leibniz is saying that the subject is not the point of view. The subject actually has a point of view. It has points of view and can always have other points of view, precisely because the superject is able to occupy and envelop all sorts of curvatures in their variations. The superject, therefore, is the affective folding of points of view, and those points of view are the modes that determine it through the folding act. So from modes of existence, we are moving to modes of possession. Why is it, however, that the points of view are so important in a lecture like mine here that wants to refer to intelligence? As I said, the most general definition of intelligence is the capacity to properly determine a problem. However, I'm aware that in my definition here, there is something that needs to be clarified if we are to avoid any hegemonical a prioris. So in other words, we need to define the properly in that definition. And that definition of the properly in this definition is what I'm going to be trying to do throughout this short lecture. So to achieve a proper definition of properly, we need to complement also our previous definition of a point of view. it's no longer just the point from which a metamorphosis is revealed, but crucially is the point from which one becomes able to arrange cases. It's almost a detective-like enterprise, the point of view, figuring how to arrange cases. As Deleuze is saying, that's fundamentally the point of view, arranging contraries, inverses, arranging opposites. He goes on, Deleuze, and he claims furthermore that to pose a problem is only feasible if one is able to occupy a point of view according to which cases can be arranged. And he provides an example through astronomy. So he says, if you take the planets, you will note an insane rotation. The rotation of the planets is such an irregular curve that one must give up on everything except if you find a point of view. The point of view is the sun. That works for the planets and for differently planetary movements. But if it works for the planetary system, it does not work for the star system. To do that, one has to find another point of view. And this is the end of the quote. So that's the power of a point of view. It immediately asks for a de-universalization, a de-generalization of perspectives, since what works for one problem can be catastrophic for another problem. So the point of view is actually immanence in action. It unleashes a creative potential of a radical perspectivism that must not be confused for everything goes, which is the postmodern dictum, and anyone can have their opinion. No, that's not the point with a point of view. The point with a point of view is actually that truth itself, any truth that we are producing, refers to a point of view. So in a problematic transformation of an object, in a problematic objectile, the intelligent point of view is the one that not only can subsume its series of transformations, but also can allow for the arrangement of cases that make the problem to be examined precisely in the way that it transforms. That's why I was insisting in my first definition of intelligence when I began 10 minutes ago, that the singular and the trivial, the ordinary, need to be examined in their tension. The singular and the ordinary. So let's put, to do that, let's put Leibniz on the easel. Let's examine Leibniz on the canvas directly and go as close as possible to him. And speaking of a canvas, I'm going to be actually almost literal about it. So what we know about a canvas is that it's made of woven yarns of countless textile fibers that are bound together so tightly that they are no longer standing in isolation, but rather form a supposed continuous surface. So in discussing the canvas as the coming together of fibers, we can sense something here. And that's a very William James's, let's say, infused approach. The many, the fibers that form one, the canvas, and are continuously tied with one another, like flies, mosquitoes, and zebras, for example. However, let's be one step more naive and keep on asking, how can these fibers weave, merge with one another? In other words, and that's the question that Deleuze poses to Leibniz, what is the necessary condition for at least two lines, two fibers to weave with one another? The simplest answer that Deleuze provides via Leibniz, and yet also the most complex, is this, that for two lines, for two fibers, for a line of zebra and a line of mosquito to meet one another, they need to fold. And why do they need to fold? Because a straight line, supposedly, let's assume that there is a straight line, cannot converge with any other, let alone fold with one another. To our amusement, this brings us to a fundamental precondition. After we have gotten rid of the straight lines and we have embraced the importance of a fold as the condition of weaving, we are also left to wonder, how can folding proceed? In other words, how can folding be not a one-off instance, but actually sustain itself to the extent that it can form a field? I was going to say a membrane, but I will not do that today because then I'm never going to finish the lecture, I mean. So if the first precondition of the Baroque, which is what Deleuze associates with Leibniz, is that it needs to fold, then the second precondition of the Baroque, according to Deleuze's Leibniz, is that the fold needs to fold to infinity. how can a fold to infinity? How can this be possible? Let's move a little bit closer. The Baroque refers not to an essence, but rather to an operative function, to a trait. It endlessly produces folds. It does not invent things, since there are all kinds of folds coming from the East, Greek, Roman, Romanesque, Gothic, or classical folds. Yet the Baroque trait twists and turns its folds, turning them into infinity, fold over fold, one upon the other. The Baroque fold unfurls all the way to infinity. So we need to avoid both straight lines because they do not fold, but we also need to avoid cycles because cycles just loop upon themselves. So where does that bring us? It will bring us somewhere, but I will continue being naive for a moment, and I will ask again then, why do we need to fold in the first place? Let's say we avoided straight lines. Let's say we avoid cycles. Let's say we keep on folding to infinity. Why do we need to fold? As Deleuze is saying, there is something very, very, very spatial, very architectural even, in the heart of Leibniz concerns, one that we cannot do without. When someone folds, when we fold something, it's actually in a very pragmatic way, it's actually to place it inside something else. So the reason for folding is to place within. I want to make a package, so I fold. I fold the paper, I fold the newspaper to put it in my pocket. I fold my handkerchief to put it in my pocket. Inclusion, says Deleuze, is the final cause of the fold. And it implies a serial operation. One folds in order to envelop, to interiorize, in order to make one's own. So we move from inflection, which is the point of folding, to inclusion, which is the purpose of folding. Before we continue, I need to make a very small detour on a figure that I love and which we spoke about a couple of years ago, and I think last year actually, and it is Raymond Rouyer. Raymond Rouyer is a philosopher. He's into something when he insists that the universe has a fibrous structure, and when he immediately adds that this fibrous structure is also a temporal one. So when you think about lines that fold, not straight lines, neither cycles, but lines that fold in order to include, think of them also in a temporal way. Each line, each fiber, expresses the continuity of an individualized existence. That's what Rouyer is saying. So each fiber of individuation, the many, folds with one another, sometimes and some places more or less intensely, and each are enveloping one another. And by doing that, they're weaving, they're making the cosmic canvas, the one. So Rouyer is very literal when he is claiming that by definition, none of the cells, and now we're going to speak about flies, none of the cells alive today has ever perished. Each dates back to the very origins of the universe. But unlike the germinal cells, each somatic cell has to confront the impasse of death. On the other hand, the schema of fibers also applies to actual physico-chemical individuals. They also date back to the origins of the universe. They have no doubt undergone countless avatars. They lost and regained electrons or photons, but these avatars are of the same order as the exchange of nuclei in the course of combination of protozoa, for example. Again, referring to Andrej's lecture, that's why the zebra can adopt the point of view of the mosquito and the other way around, because they are coming from their expressions, let's say, of a common collective unfolding. That's also why Deleuze, referring to Leibniz, says that the first fly contains the seeds that all the flies came from, with each individual fly being called in its turn to unfold its own parts at the right time and at the right space. Likewise, Leibniz says, when an individual organism dies, it does not really vanish and disappear, but rather it folds upon itself, involuting into the again dormant seed by skipping all immediate stages. So the fibers inflect, fold and weave, thickening the canvas at points, forcing individuals to emerge, only so that they can later fold inwards, back to the canvas, back to the weaving, back to the cosmic fold, back to yet another inflection. And now we go to the gist of this short lecture. So inflection, which is the fundamental presupposition of a point of view, inflection can be described as an intrinsic singularity. It's not an extreme, what is called mathematically an extrinsic singularity, since it's not standing at a minimum, neither a maximum. It's neither a high nor a low. It's neither right nor left. It's neither regressive nor progressive. It corresponds, inflection, corresponds to what Leibniz calls an ambiguous sign. For Deleuze, this ambiguous inflection point is weightless, and he is spot on when he claims that inflection is the pure event on the line. It's a pure event because it's a spatiotemporal instance where the world is fully undecided, is fully virtual. It does not yet know where to go next. And on that inflection point, Deleuze would make three more claims. He would claim that it can never be exact, isolated, or identified, since no one really knows where a line is inflecting. However, and that's his second claim, everyone knows when a line inflects, and this is why we can mathematically describe it with accuracy. The inflection point of a fold is therefore simultaneously, and you heard this phrase before, unexact yet rigorous. His third point that he's making about inflection is, in my opinion, one of the most important claims in the history of philosophy. So Deleuze is saying that when we move from a branching of inflection, we distinguish a point that's no longer what runs along inflection, nor is it the point of inflection itself. It's the one in which the lines perpendicular to the tangents meet in a state of variation. It's not exactly a point, but a place, a position, a site, a linear focus, a line emanating from lines. To the degree it represents variation or inflection, it can be called a point of view. Such is the basis of perspectivism, which does not mean a dependence in respect to a pre-given defined subject. To the contrary, a subject will be what comes to the point of view, or rather what remains in the point of view. So with this simple move that Deleuze does, and I'm done with the quote, philosophy will never be the same again. Philosophy actually was never the same again since Leibniz, but Deleuze is emphasizing that. Any notion, any concept, from the most profound to the most mundane, can never be absolute. With a point of view, philosophy and thinking become relative in the sense of becoming relational, and therefore philosophy becomes ecological. Philosophy cybernetizes itself. We are now fully immersed in a world where thinking is environmental. I know that Andrej loves this problem, and we use it in the book that he just mentioned that will be out in a few months. But think of the corner problem, let's say. Think of the Acropolis in Athens, and think of the columns of the Acropolis. In that corner problem of the Acropolis, the singular and the ordinary are in a continuous interplay, and it's only the corner point of view, literally moving to the corner yourself, that assigns value to the way that they're entangled with one another, in order for you to figure out which is the corner column. In this sense, the point of view has a dual power. It can not only reveal the metamorphosis of an object, but it can also allow, as we said, the subject that occupies it to be able to arrange cases. It's now that the relation between the point of view and intuition starts to come forth, and that's why Deleuze claimed, as we saw, that one is able to pose a problem if they are able to determine the point of view according to which one can arrange the cases that correspond to the problem. So this radical perspectivism is not obeying a supposed relativity of truth. There's not a single truth on which we can hold that and form supposedly subjective opinions. On the contrary, perspectivism entails the truth of the relative. Truth itself refers to points of view. In other words, the point of view is the condition of possibility of the manifestation and the constitution of truth in a domain. There can be, for example, gravitational points of view that produce Newtonian forces, and there can be relational points of view that produce Einsteinian fields. In the very same issue, in the issue of gravity, there is radically different points of view in Newton's forces and in Einstein's theory of relativity. The crucial thing is actually to find yourself occupying, and I'm very literal here, try to occupy a point of view that allows for an affective registering of all sorts of transformations, as they are now bound together by a single problem, which is the one that the point of view expresses and exposes. So the point of view is never just a means through which we can just occupy a form. It is actually the means through which one can occupy and seize a series of forms in the way that they move from the one to the other. Topology, by the way, which many architects are quite friendly to, topology is precisely studying that, these serial transformations once you've occupied the point of view. So it's the necessary condition, the point of view, to intuit inflections despite all their weightlessness, despite all their virtuality. As such, to occupy a point of view or a surface of neighboring or even contradicting points of view that have the power to arrange the seriality of individuating fibers in the way that they weave with one another, actually attunes us in a very special kind of difference, a kind of difference that we can call internal. Internal difference, or how something differs from itself. So how do we move from column, 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 suddenly corner, column, 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 in my example that I take from Andrej's fascination with the corner columnate problem. So this internal understanding of difference is actually firmly opposed to external difference. It's not interested in how something looks different from something else in extensive terms, in shapes and contours, but rather in how something differs from itself while individuating, while transforming. Internal difference, and we spoke about it 2 years ago when referring to Bergson, in one term, the differential, can affirmatively address differences in transformations, in individuations, and as such express the power of each individual, allowing us to distinguish between lines of individuation, while also being able to examine how, when, and where they can weave and fold, mix with one another. It was Bergson, as I said, that gave a very special name to that internal difference, and he called it duration, by bringing it together with a very novel understanding of time, one that claims that at the basis of any intuitive attempt, internal difference becomes primary, since time is not measured metrically, but is understood in the way that it plays out, that it expresses itself in its duration. Bergson would define duration as that which differs from itself, for the essence of time is to continuously change and become over to what it was, to inflect and to include. In this respect, duration is not merely a difference of nature in contrast to other natures. The nature of duration is to differ in nature, again, to inflect and include. The upshot of this is that the division at play here is not so much between two differences of nature, but rather the separation of differences of nature from differences in degree. The issue, sorry for the mishap. The issue is no longer, therefore, if we follow Leibniz, the issue is no longer to compare, for example, a brunette and a blonde hair and color. The issue is actually to sense how blonde blondes, how brunette brunettes, to move therefore from the descriptive exhaustive to the sensitively intuitive and intensive. So how does something differ internally in the way that it unfolds in duration? As you might expect by now, and this will bring us full cycle in a bit, something differs internally whenever its rate of change changes, whenever it inflects, as we saw with the previous discussion on inflection. So every inflection is an individuating fiber constitutes a differential. So now we are facing two consequences if we aim to intuit the individuation of a line. We need, first of all, as we said, to occupy a point of view that can allow us to sense where the individuation is going. And when we have a point of view, and that's why they're weightless, the inflection points, we need to actually experiment with a point of view from where we're standing, with manners that can add expressive weight to the inflection points. So we need to literally pick our brushes or our pencils as architects, think and theme, immerse them in colors, delicately and violently, simultaneously, move our hands and actually attack the cosmic canvas. That's the only way we can express the inflection point. That expressive attack to the cosmos is actually what Bergson was calling intuition. where the fibers get to express themselves in the way that they inflect, so much so that we no longer need to rely only on those that have happened in the past, but we can actually let our whole bodies sense the inflections that are yet to come. Every designer actually does that thing, not only relying on the inflections of the individuating past, but being able to sense how can the so-called future individuate, where can the future inflect. Our cosmic painting, therefore, is not an issue of abstraction or representation. Our intuitive cosmic painting is one that must be exercised in order to fold and fold to infinity. We need to paint in manners that do not create a shape that's closed. Even if it's very abstract or representative, it matters little. So we must, in other words, paint lines that pass between things. We must never close a contour. We must breathe with our whole body through the expression of an inflection, and in doing so, become the inflection itself. Sense the inflection that is just around the corner. So from inflection to inflection, with each one of them now expressed through our experiments, each one of them having a weight that could not have had otherwise, architecture can now engage with the problem of intensity itself, with the logic of continuity and the event. So architectural intuition can now actually become much closer to another favorite term of mine from Simondon, can actually become close to what Simondon, as I said, was calling transduction, an expressive intuition that allows the formation of a genetic conception, to formulate genetic ideas, genetic concepts, concepts that speak about how things are happening, following from beginning to end the manner in which each moment or phase makes the next moment or phase possible by creating original conditions for its genesis. So when you express one inflection point, being immediately able to sense where is this going to lead you, to what other inflection point is this going to lead you. So in simple terms, for a point of view to be able to perceive the transformations of a problem, it needs to be able to perceive the events that transform it, the inflections in the curvature of its line. And that's what the singular stands for: point of inflection, event in transformation, moment of envelopment. It's opposed to the ordinary because the trivial and the ordinary simply indicate the continuity of inertia. We no longer want inertia. We long for dynamic genesis. And almost going towards the end, the singular is actually the remarkable gasp of transformation, there from which we actually embark on a journey of no return. To operate on a problem implies actually precisely this, and that's what we need Leibniz for. We need Leibniz and his ideas on analysis, that's what he was calling it, in order to occupy a point of view that can allow us to perceive what's singular and ordinary in a problem of ours. As Deleuze wonderfully puts it when referring to Leibnizian analysis, let's take our lives and do our own surgery, our logical surgery. This will be in your life as you see it, extracting singularities, all the moments that make up for events. This happens a lot depending on the scale. A bird's eye view, a close-up view, there are many of those, but it matters little. In the end, at the spot where everything seemed ordinary, you will perhaps see that everything had already singularities. There are perpetually singularities going into singularities, inflection to inflection, but you also find the opposite, that where you thought something was very important, it was ordinary. The coincidence of two ordinaries is actually required for there to be a singularity. And that's the end of the quote. Therefore, the capacity of a point of view to arrange cases in order to properly determine a problem affects, wait for it, both the ways that we are collectively remembering, how do we store and archive all the inflection points that have happened in the past, together with the points of views that we occupy to figure them out, but also, next to it, how do we plan together? How can we intuit together all the points of inflection and the points of view that are needed, that are not with us yet, and they need to be made, they need to be produced, they're yet to come. So if to occupy a point of view is to express clearly the small part of the world that's linked directly with our own body, then what about all those points of view that we did not perceive directly in the past, that's the archiving part, or in the future, that's the instituting part? The response is that clarity itself needs to be understood in gradients. what I experience from my point of view right now might be very clear to me, but thankfully, I can also occupy points of view of what others have experienced in the form of, Simondon would call this technicity, Stigler would speak about it in terms of grammatization, Leibniz would say in the form of blind knowledge, a knowledge that comes from the past, knowledge of others in the form of a book. That's why Leibniz would say, in an almost Spinozian kind of way, that the best soul, the best monad, the best individual is the one, the most intelligent, I was going to say also, is the one that are able to enlarge the region of clear expression. So the degree of someone's intelligence, the degree of wisdom, as Leibniz would say, is directly connected with the field of vision and with the increased multiplicity of points of view that they can occupy. And before I close the lecture, let's also ask ourselves, why don't we do that then? Why don't we continuously occupy points of view? Why do we act stupidly? The same way, Leibniz says, the same way that someone has intelligence, the same way we also have stupidity. We are not born with it, we have it, we possess it. Actively then strive for it. The stupid, for Leibniz, he holds a special name for it, it's the damned. The damned continues to express the whole world, of course, every monad does that, according to Leibniz, but the subdivision of that expression is almost reduced to zero. Its point of views are fundamentally diminished and reduced only to one. So the damned, the stupid, is actually interested only in one point of view, therefore only in the things that are of immediate relation to that point of view. The stupid or the idiot is the one who claims to possess the single universal point of view. Idiocy, which is another synonym of stupidity, is when all cases that matter are literally arranged only on the basis of what suits you. And therefore, this very you of yours becomes actually, or gets to have the feeling that they are a universal you, the only you that matters. So Leibniz is at his very best when he claims that the stupid person, the damned person, is not eternally damned. No one is damned forever. No one is stupid forever. But however, they are forever damnable and damn themselves at every moment. So to be stupid takes a lot of effort. To be idiot, in the sense of focusing on one point of view, takes a lot of effort. However, it is also a soothing choice. It's also a choice that makes one calm and reassure themselves. It's also sometimes energetically mindful, since we don't need to spend any effort in moving to find another point of view. So stupidity is systemic precisely because it can very often be very easy to be stupid. And escaping it, in all the monetizing, profitable, and overwhelming charm that it has, is actually a question of energetics, devoted energetics of self-enjoyment that we can achieve only by going outside of ourselves. So Leibniz is paradoxical here. He says that to achieve self-enjoyment, you need to go outside of yourself. As Deleuze claims by working with Leibniz, whatever the abomination of the world might be, there is something that cannot be taken from you and from which you are becoming invincible. This is not your supposed stupid egotism. It's certainly not your egotism. It's not your tiny pleasure about being me. It's something much more grandiose that Whitehead called precisely self-enjoyment, this kind of vital heart in which you contract your elements, whether these are elements of music, of chemistry, of vibratory waves, and become yourself by contracting these elements and by turning yourself back to those elements. And I end the quote. The issue, therefore, is how can we escape our damnation, our collective idiotic, stupid fate, by figuring out ways in which we can enjoy ourselves by going beyond ourselves, thinking with both the objectiles, the inflection points, and the points of view that make us, as well also with the objectiles, and that's the important bit, the inflection points and the points of view that can be for others, not simply our own, strictly our own. How can we, in other words, sense one another in a manner that can express both the fact that we are bound, we are all in one canvas, and also we are differing. There is many fibers in that one canvas. So, and I'm in the last slide, in such an understanding of self-enjoyment, what is actually becoming critical is the amplitude of point of view. How many points of view can we occupy and allow ourselves to become, also to become for others. Therefore, and now that's perhaps the only point that architecture becomes so prominent in this short lecture, architecture can be really vital in this, since it has the capacity to both construct and remove points of view, to archive, let's say, expressions of certain experiential regions, the manner, for example, that light enters through the well-established figure of a window next to me here. However, also to institute regions that we are yet to experience. For example, think what the people back in the 1940s were feeling when the facade completely opened up and now the whole building became a window, altering the notion of light itself. In both cases, intelligence, in both cases, I mean, of archiving or instituting, intelligence is no longer confused with universal ideas. There's no such thing as generalized intelligence, artificial or otherwise. Intelligence, including architectural intelligence, becomes the self-enjoying art of going beyond the given, and in doing so, inflecting value in a world that when eventually, hopefully, includes it, it will no longer be the same. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Stavros. Thank you, Andrej. That was a tour de force. What I find astonishing is the way that you guys have such a productive kind of thinking relationship. A kind of the Deleuze and Guattari maybe of our architectural world. I want to invite questions, and I'm not going to say I'm quite out of my depth here in this particular area. Except I do have a general sort of question I want to throw out to you, and that is to say, I mean, just to try and connect it with the world of AI in the sense of I mean, just a brief overview. You know, the first 50 years were dominated by symbolic AI, about a kind of AI based on logic, and there was an explicit rejection of the biological, in the sense that when they held their first meeting back in '56, they didn't invite Norbert Wiener, who of course was the kind of the figure behind the cybernetic and the kind of the biological in general terms. Now there was an alternative history going on in the world of AI, which was to do with comparing AI to the brain, with the neural network, and so on. And from Alan Turing onwards, we can see a number of attempts, but then tragically, well, for whatever reason, that died out quite literally in some senses. So I just wanted to ask this kind of question in the sense that we on the one hand, Leibniz is kind of talking about a way of thinking that is clearly kind of based on logic and so on. The same time, there seems to be infused by something else. Now, this is the kind of question: to what extent is it infused by the biological? In other words, to what extent can we still see connections with that other side of the world of AI, with the kind of the kind of neural network logic? Yeah.
Andrej, you want to go while I intake my nicotine?
It's only fair. I mean, you've been talking. I just maybe I can. First of all, I thank you for your kind, generous comments. Maybe it would be interesting because I'm actually quite keen on answering that question. But you said that you appreciate the dynamics. We have had I mean, there was a point. It was, I think, 6 years ago that we were asked to take over the architecture and philosophy course from a very significant figure who and then at that point we have to reassess and think, how do we do it? How do we the shoes that to be filled are big. We have to figure out, can we do it and how do we do it? And one of the first decisions that we made is that we wouldn't deliver lectures, but we would turn it into what I've now in retrospect recognized almost as like a jazz session, where the two of us are fully prepared and yet attuned to the temperature of the room, and possibly following, to use the vocabulary that Stavros was appropriating from Rouyer, to figure out what are the fibers in the room, could range from a naive question by students, simple question of disambiguation or something that people have read, and then try to bring it into the discourse in a way of an open, half-baked, discussion which takes us elsewhere. And it seems to it took hold, and it seems to work, and it energizes. It fuels our conversations, and eventually, I mean, the proof is in the book that we've written in the space of I think 7 months in the same mode of exchange, back and forth, trying out things, and maybe also deciding that we would never distinguish between research and education. That is to say, everything that we've been discussing formally or informally in our exchanges on WhatsApp, that finds its way back into the classroom, and it's been tested as we speak. Sometimes, really, that's why I say half-baked, because we precisely wanted to keep it fresh enough so that we are energized ourselves to think through these things, which of course has a wonderful consequence. We have aligned sufficiently to be able to write with two hands. This is something that I have not achieved before this companionship. But back to your question, I have started the lecture by indeed reminding ourselves that Wiener, of all people, have really considered Leibniz as a patron saint of cybernetics, and I think it is really unique. How did you started, Stavros, by saying that every morning we should think of Leibniz? I think he becomes incredibly pertinent today, especially in the wake of everything that is happening, like with large language models and artificial intelligence and everything, all the things that we have as of recently at our disposal. But I think that I would like to frame this question. I did hint at this possibility. I was hoping actually we'll tackle it in the Q&A. And here I'm influenced by a recent book called Digital Theory, with 4 authors who are also discussing this issue, and they want to frame Deleuze and Deleuze's reading of Leibniz in particular as something that was addressing the problem of what you referred to, Neil, as symbolic AI. So, and the symbolic AI, in the way they frame it, could be considered as the AI that disregards the analog and really is about the manipulation of the digits, or that is to say, discretized or grammatized elements. And of course, a great Hubert Dreyfus is the one who was for many years the advocate of trying to remind us that we cannot simply willfully dismiss the continuous. And now the punchline is like, it seems to me that Leibniz does not take sides in this conversation between the digital and the analog. And he does provide for the possibility of, or as I call it, reconciling the two without conflating them abruptly. And I think Deleuze does really give him a credit precisely for that, so that all, in terms of the pendulum, we've been, of course, from the symbolic AI to the continuous AI. It seems to me that we have yet to understand what Leibniz was about, and maybe, to my mind, it's very clear that we cannot. It's finding the measure between the abstract, too abstract and not abstract enough. And it seems to me that he is the one who gives us the conceptual tools to think the logic of continuity with Peirce and the logic of discreteness that we have, appropriated without, repeating myself, without conflating them. At this point, I hope Stavros will jump in, because
no, I mean, yeah, I can jump in, of course, but if you remember that line, let's say, that I had in a point in this portrait eventually of Leibniz, and put anything you want in that line, make it about examining any sorts of, let's say, history of something, or the way that something transforms. It can be a personal problem, it can be a work problem, it can be the development of an object throughout its lifetime, anything. In there, and that's why he's considered to be the saint figure of cybernetics, Leibniz. In there, if you figure out the points of inflection, so the points where actually a transformation happens, knowing how to figure that out might help you figure out which are the ones to come, so how it could change in the future. Therefore, perhaps at the end, you might know how to control the transformations of something. That's the entry point where Leibniz connects with cybernetics. Cybernetics, in the original Greek meaning of the term, from kybernetes, means basically to govern, being able to govern. It's not only connected with the digital, so-called digital as automated, let's say, variations of it. It's a broader issue about how could we govern things. Assuming, therefore, we use Leibniz and his understanding of inflection points in order to be able to govern things, that's why Andrej says that he doesn't pick sides, because he moves beyond the symbolic by telling you that to figure out how to govern things by learning the inflection points, you need to occupy a point of view. And when he says that you need to occupy a point of view, he makes quite a lot of effort to put forward the claim that that point of view is not symbolic alone. It needs to be, for lack of a better term, and I'm simplifying now, it needs to be environmental and embodied. It needs to happen somewhere, precisely because when it happens somewhere, you have a certain skin in the game, and that having of a skin in the game alerts you so much, that increases your sensitivity so much, that allows for your intuition to operate to degrees that will help you to find out that inflection point. So that's why, again, Leibniz stands in the middle, let's say, between the so-called fluid analog, the line as it unfolds, and the discrete digital, the points, the data that we extract out of a line, basically telling us we need to find ways to work always with the two together. That's what we were discussing on Friday here, but that's probably relevant in a YouTube lecture to say dates. But what we're discussing with the excuse of the bacteria book, of the recent book of Colomin and Wigley, was that yes, the bacteria is an analog. You could see it like that, fluid of matter. Let's put it broadly. However, we're continuously, and that's the human enterprise. That's the thing that makes the human human. We're continuously out of that fluid matter extracting concepts, that's the digital operation, in order to figure out how do we deal with that. This problem of the fluid and what do we extract out of that fluidity of matter is not only a problem of 2026 or after the 1940s, is not a problem only of the Industrial Revolution onwards, is literally the problem that makes the human human. That's what Leibniz says. Leibniz says that humans are humans because they create concepts. And later on, when Deleuze comes in the picture and twists Leibniz, when Simondon comes in the picture, or Ruyer comes in the picture, where Stigler comes in the picture, they're saying on top of that, that yes, the humans are humans by making concepts out of everything, but the way that they make these concepts is always technological, is always by exteriorizing themselves through technology onto the environment. In a way, if this was a seminar and not an online lecture, I could do it more properly and interactively. You can take techno-logos and you can equate it with making concepts. And that's basically the history of a species. Techno-logos, making concepts. And Leibniz says, and I'm closing this short monologue, Leibniz says, basically, for whatever happens to you, don't dispute, calculate. Calculate how the analog and the digital can weave with one another. That's why he says, not disputamus, calculamus. Let's calculate. That's where the calculus comes from. It was his effort to see how these two can weave continuously with one another without picking any side.
And it never stops. That's what
No, exactly. It falls to infinity.
It's the evolution that continues. I think Katarina has a question.
May I?
Please go on. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. Was quite dense, and I was in the middle. I had the feeling, where are they going to? Where do you want to take us? And I was in the end then quite happy, because it's long forgotten for me that there was this concept of the vinculum, or how you call it, the vinculum. And I think there's one thing important in Leibniz, of course, that he says that the souls or spirit and the body, they cannot influence each other. And that's why he assumed this harmony of the state. It just looks like they would influence each other, but they cannot, in fact. So there's not the power of it. And then that there is quite late in his life that he came up with this idea of a vinculum, which is sort of a theory of circumstances. So there's one point of the relation between the soul and the body, but the question is still how are all the individuals, which are soul and body, are also interact with each other. So there's more to it. And I wanted to ask you about this because you spoke about the difference also in possession, the aspect of possession, the aspect of folding in, right, where Deleuze finds a topological solution. And so I wanted to hear if you could add this circle of the monads, because you have the circle of all the monads, because what Deleuze, he multiplies the whole concept of the monad, and this concept of the vinculum. How would you, with what I just mapped out, I think you see where I'm aiming for. I wanted to know how you would speak more about this vinculum itself as this hook or place or possibility. I don't know how Deleuze describes it. So if you could say something to that, it would be nice.
You want to go, Andrej?
Shall I?
One and one. Yeah.
For me, maybe the answer is in the, I think, my third slide, because I think in the, and this is why I evoke also the two books by Guerrero, because she is really among very few people who interestingly, I mean, who really insist that the causalities we cannot continue to reduce the causalities to the mechanical linear chain, which is something that science is actually preferred, because all the other kinds of causality are not as easy to capture or understand. So in monadology, in 2 or 3 places, he talks about the distinction between mechanicism and for the lack of a better word, vitalism. The fact that I very quickly gloss over the tradition that I think it was listed in one of Stavros's slides, that of Stoic. I see it in terms of like Stoic understanding that every corporeal cause has an incorporeal effect that in turn becomes a quasi cause, and this is really my obsession. So that is to say, yes, the mechanical causal, the efficient cause certainly is operates among bodies, but when it comes to the problem of final cause, and here I immediately refer to it as the final cause, that what used to be known as entelechy or teleological cause, but it's not teleological because there is no goal that it's driving towards, because it's precisely the arrangement of the state of affairs produces an effect that in turn becomes a quasi cause. There's no correspondence or direct connection between the two. Neither, like there is the two are working together, and I think this is to my understanding, this is what they mean by Leibniz means by harmony. That the vinculum actually is that mechanism of the actual state of affairs producing a virtual condition that in turn has the capacity to rearrange the degrees of freedom at the state of the manifest reality. So that I think this is how I read the conundrum of the vinculum substantiale, and I think it's this is what he means by of course, bodies and souls and how different they might be. But most importantly, when we talk about that, so not the efficient cause, but the final cause, we are immediately in the realm of what I refer to as the eco-axiology. So the idea of this is where the value comes from. This is what eventually this quasi-cause the capacity to rearrange the degrees of freedom is that immediately, and I think many authors such as Masumi would agree that this is the place of value as that which determines whether you go left or right. You determines any and every action in this kind of quasi-causal way. Stavros.
The vinculum is no other than what James also calls pure experience. That's the thing that calls that holds the one and the many together. The one world that has many bodies and many also monads, even though they might be considered separate from one another. So it's a very interesting thing to connect with harmony the way that Leibniz did and Andrej mentioned, and I think it's a very interesting thing for architects since this is the entry point of what we are doing together here, because architects should also come to terms with the fact that they can themselves figure out ways of let's say, simply put, conceptualizing the vinculum in terms of creating a joint, an architectural joint in a building. Let's say how the roof joins the wall is actually, I mean, you know, armos, it's the Greek term for joint. That's where Leibniz picks up the term. That's where the term harmony comes from. So to occupy yourself as a point of view that makes you yourself, let's say, occupy yourself with the business of creating all sorts of joints, all sorts of harmonies, can actually figure out ways that you cannot wait to the vinculum, but you can express the vinculum. You can express that which holds the one and the many together. And I take the vinculum more than anything else as this experiential dynamism of how things are holding together, both their thingness, but also their sameness, both what makes them different, but also what makes them part of one, whatever that one be. That one is always very open, and thank God it's very open. If it was closed, it would be very boring. It would be unsustainable. And thank God also that there is, however, this one, open one, to hold us together. If it was each one fully on their own, then also it would be unsustainable. So I think, in other words, that since it's also architecture and philosophy, the title of the series, architects have as much interesting things to say eventually about the vinculum, as many as Leibniz had to say, if they were to take also their enterprise quite seriously, not just as a matter of putting just lines on a paper or a matter opposed to matter. It's more than that. We are vinculum specialists, architects.
So just wondering, are there any questions that are coming in? Maybe those on YouTube who would like to put a question in the chat. No, I'm left. Sorry, someone make.
No, go on, please.
No, I'm left with this very strong sense of the dialectic of this of the discrete and the continuous and so on, which is, of course, is very Deleuzian. In a, you know, the rhizome being that kind of logic itself. So, you know, but in Deleuze it's more ambiguous, I would thought. I'm struggling to find Leibniz to kind of to see it quite. Maybe, well, you know, guys know more about it than I do. I also was a little bit. I'm a little nervous of the discussion of the fold, especially in the context of Deleuze, in a kind of quasi architectural formal logic. I mean, John Radman was telling me that that apparently Deleuze had a huge following within the surfing community because they took literally the notion of the fold as being part of that sort of as a kind of related it to surfing culture, and actually Deleuze refers to surfing in his work. And I think in architecture we had an example of, and I don't want to drift away from Leibniz and towards Deleuze, but we had the difficulty of Greg Lynn coming in and writing about producing an AD on the fold as a kind of literal, as though it was referring to form. But I've always thought of philosophy not at all to form in any way, but towards a kind of intersubjectivity and so on. So I'm always nervous about that literal articulation of the fold.
It has been, as we know, I mean, interpreted in a very literal terms. But I think what is really extraordinary about this is, if we exit this the distinction between the necessary and the contingent that Stavros was on and on about, by the necessity to consider everything in terms of the singular and ordinary, because singular and ordinary, they are never fixed in advance. Then you could say that even at the most
not only for constituted individuals. So not only, Andrej has different singular and ordinaries than me or you, Neil, but also each one of you, through different, let's say, experiential instances, have different singular and ordinaries that could exchange positions. So they're very relative. But yeah, Andrej.
Very relative. I'm glad that you said it, because it, like we can think of this at a very formal level. Every straight line looks like every other straight line, and therefore it's a universal concept. You can say, when we say straight line, it will be straight forever, eternally, and everywhere. When we say a fold is a singular concept, because no two folds are the same. They're all different, but they're folding. So I think it's already at that level. He is attuning us to something else. And I think a good example would be, and this is what I think is very helpful when Delanda does this. He says, like the boiling point is not a universal point, because it differs. We know that the state of body of water, if you pump in energy, it will eventually reach what we refer to as the boiling point. But the boiling point in the Netherlands is very different. It occurs at a different moment than in Mexico, let's say, at the high altitude. It's 96 degrees as opposed to the Netherlands is 100 degrees. So it seems to me that the folding has the capacity to capture something in this plastic way, where the condition is not bigger than the condition. This is where the concept is not so loose so as to encompass everything and anything. It is precise enough, and it allows for a certain leeway in how Whitehead would.
There is another way. Sorry, Andrej, but there is another way to understand the fold. The folding should be understood operationally. And I already, what's his name? Michael speaks, right? Michael speaks in the introduction, I think, to the book of Bernard Cash, Earth Moves. He's already making a point, even in anticipation of how it would be misunderstood literally and formalistically, in the bad sense of the term formalism. So how the fold is understood in a bad way, or was understood in a bad way, let's say architecturally in the early 90s and onwards, as literally folding, like shapes that look like folds. He was already anticipating that, and he was already making a claim that let's try to understand the fold in a manner that is operational. So if you understand the fold in a manner that's operational, that's why I also, and in the book we expand on it, but that's why in the lecture here, I was mentioning these three elements that Deleuze was putting forward, that the fold is to inflect. So first and foremost, a fold is a fold when it changes. It's not a straight line. Also, it's a fold when it continues to infinity. It does not close upon itself like a cycle, and therefore it should subsume everything. And thirdly, it has a purpose. And the purpose of folding things, Leibniz was very pragmatic there, is to include them somewhere. So you fold the paper to put it in your pocket. That's why you fold. So you fold in order to interiorize. In a very surprising move, even though he does not credit Leibniz directly, Simondon was extremely influenced by him when he was making, and that I also consider it, if I could expand, I would have, but there was obviously no time. He also makes this understanding, this operational understanding of the fold as the thing that inflects in order to include. He also makes it his basis in distinguishing between living things and non-living things. Basically, he's saying that non-living things, they can inflect, they can fold, of course, but they fail short in including. So if you break a rock, when breaking, obviously it has encountered a folding with the world where something changed in it. It's no longer the same. It broke in two. However, it does not interiorize that change. It does not take that change with it and carries it with it. If I take a knife now, and I'm not going to do that for practical reasons because we are in Zoom, but also I wouldn't do it for any other reason. But if I was going to stab Neil now, so if I'm going to take a knife and stab him, Neil is not only gonna have a scar in his skin, Neil, assuming he survives the stab, is always going to carry the stab with him. He's always going to carry the inclusion of the stab way beyond the skin. And that's what, according to Simondon, following Leibniz, that's what makes a living system be a living system, the fact that it can interiorize. Why is this very interesting? It's very interesting because it also opens up life to many ways of the organic and the inorganic coming together. Because in that sense, architecture is also alive. Architecture is very much alive because it includes all sorts of systems, let's call them subsystems, that are carrying with them the inclusions of the things that happen in them. So
like
in one go, Simondon, sorry?
Like what you said with the first fly.
Includes all the flies that come. But in a way, Simondon, by misabusing and playing with Leibniz, he, by very precise terms, distinguishes the living with the non-living, and simultaneously he opens up the living to the most playful great degree, where we can speak about all sorts of assemblages, to use Delanda's term, all sorts of assemblages of machinic assemblages, organic assemblages, inorganic assemblages, AI assemblages, automated assemblages. If they are able to carry the inclusion with them of what happens to them, then they are living. And I'm going to continue one last part of that small monologue again. It, however, opens up to another discussion, and that's the discussion that Stigler wants to bring, as we were saying last year. What happens to us if we lose our capacity to carry the inclusion? So when Stigler speaks about proletariats, about our current condition as being one of proletarianization, he's referring to the loss of knowledge of carrying with us the inclusion of what happens to us. So when, for example, we outsource all our thinking processes to what we now call colloquially AI, let's say, so when all our reasoning, which by the way always is relational if we follow Leibniz, when it's outsourced, what is happening there, and that's the tragic that Stigler identifies, we are losing our capacity to know how to include what happens to us. So us, the living, nice things, can very easily become non-living things, much like a rock, because we have just things happening on us, inflections happening on us, but we are unable to carry them. And if we are unable to carry them, we can also not plan ahead for all the possible fantastic, amazing inflections that we could also counter-effectuate to the world. So that's why, again, I think that Leibniz, in the current 26 techno-social, cultural environment we find ourselves in, he can be very helpful because he can point to us ways on how we can not pick sides, the side of the analog or the side of the digital, but pick the sides or find out the sides that can help us keep on carrying inclusions, keep on being able to know why we can go ahead with what happened to us rather than just things coming our way and us consuming.
This is also why, I did refer to this alloplastic assemblage, which includes everything and anything, inanimate and animate stuff and so on. But it seems to me that when it comes to contemporary discussions on where Hu is making a case for the necessity of retaining a certain degree of techno-diversity, so precisely so as to not to fall into the trap of monoculture, like revamping the idea of cultural industry of Adorno and Horkheimer. It is really I don't know whether it's ethical to share this, but it seems as if automation of thought through the monopoly of 2 or 3 glorified search machines, it actually they do feed you so that you have there's no leeway, there's no way you can actually embody this knowledge. You simply consume it, as I'm reiterating to a certain extent what Stavros is saying. There's a beautiful essay that we have shared the other day. It's called Vector Generation, that actually deals with this, the condition of smoothness and how there is no friction whatsoever. Everything just flows. Everything is on the tip of the, and the way that I see it is that there is really no vinculum here. Everything is short-circuited. The existential and the conceptual is so close together that there's no space for, let's say, probing and figuring out whether we can.
Sorry, very quickly. That's the vectoralism what's the name of a lady? Mackenzie Ward. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the vectoralism, where basically she's claiming that it's the next states that replaced capitalism, is precisely this: is inflection, 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 but without any inclusion. So without the capacity to include the inflection. So it's simply a series of inflections, informational, let's say, digital inflections, without any capacity to include why and what is happening.
So we've got a couple of questions in the chat from Radman and also from Gustavo. Maybe just a kind of quick comment. I think, you know, there was the famous study that was done at MIT in the Media Lab, where they showed basically that if people were just kind of outsourcing everything to ChatGPT and their brain was literally switching off, it was kind of like, and that was obviously a very negative aspect of how one might engage with computers. But at the same time, there's the notion of co-intelligence that has been put forward. I'm just blanking on the name of the author of that book, but the idea that actually you could also see the incorporation of AI as a kind of as a kind of like a way of introducing an interlocutor, of having a dialogue, and actually opening up and extending the possibility of thinking. Critical thinking could be expanded by that. And the other research that was done also in Cambridge on the other university at Harvard was shown that the quality of the output can be enhanced by 40%. So to my mind, that is the real potential, not just outsourcing and shutting off, but actually, you know, expanding and engaging and creating this kind of almost rhizomatic engagement with
making with, as Haraway says, making with. And I think this is the thesis of Catherine Hale's Bacteria to AI. I mean, she is not technophobic at all. I mean, she says, let's do something meaningful with this, rather than just consume passively and turn ourselves into, you know.
Well, just one etymological comment. I know that Stavros is keen on promoting the Greek way, but I mean, computation is actually it means to think together. Literally, that is
co-thinking. Yeah.
Okay, so, Pan, we'd like to ask your question, if you're still here, and also Gustavo. I don't know if either Gustavo or Pan.
Oh, I can ask my question, Neil. Sorry about that.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah. Thank you for the wonderful lecture, Andrej and Stavros. I'm right now in the middle of this. I've been in this reading group for Deleuze's reading group at 1,000 Plateaus for almost a year, and a lot of we're reading a paragraph a week and spending 2 hours on that paragraph.
Nice.
And the leader of the group is Andrew Culp, who wrote Dark Deleuze. And he's actually looking at the contemporary understanding of how Deleuze's thought and operations can affect some sort of change in problem solving. So I guess my question directly is, in the two presentations, I can conceptually understand Leibniz and this understanding of how we deduce or understand patterns and the errant ways that we can jump to conclusions to not solve problems for the many, but focus on the few. So it's basically like an illusion. And I think my question is, how do we release ourselves from this? We've been captured by capitalism. We've been captured by the illusion that design can solve things, that architecture can solve everything. That's not true. But at some point, there is an illusion of that. How do we get to look at a balance between the humanities, philosophy, science, and our own instincts right now as contemporary beings to solve these bigger problems like climate change or the ethics in AGI, something that's more practical? Because I think that's what sometimes I miss the beauty of D&G is that they have this beautiful open-ended way of thinking. But in the practical sense, what can we do?
I'm thinking first, it's a great luxury to really, as you said, study one paragraph because now, you know, we tend to in the past 20 years, we would assign whole books as reading assignments and then chapters and then bits and pieces. And eventually, I think nobody will read beyond maybe just a few lines and quotes. So that's fantastic. I just want to also mention in the same breath that the fall, the book is notoriously hermetic and difficult, and we profited greatly from the work of Charles Stivall and Dan Smith, who have meticulously translated and transcribed lectures of Deleuze. So, sometimes there is a paragraph in the book which is expanded, unfolded in the lecture itself, and it takes maybe like 30 pages are compressed into a single paragraph, which is ridiculous. But to your very direct question, I think we live in the under the regime of solutionism, and it seems to me that our machines are helping us to be smooth, to use this the vectorial analogy, the vectorial space of smoothness. What I think is necessary, and here I'm always evoking the same reference because I think that there's something profound in this attempt. And this is the work of SenseLab, Masumi and Manning, and as of lately they call themselves the Three Ecologies Institute. And the book that I'm particularly, increasingly more interested in is this book that calls for a pragmatics of the useless. So it seems to me that when we are talking about intelligence, it is still too much intelligence that has a particular goal in mind, either tacitly or covertly. But I think what maybe in architecture we are trying to establish that sometimes it is this the playful attitude where you're not goal oriented, where you're not rushing to solve a problem or through optimization, and that can be done really increasingly more efficiently, rather to dwell on, and I think we both touched on it, on the problem itself, how the problem is posed, how to populate the problem with all kinds of folds before we actually jump to conclusions. And I think this is, I'm tempted to distinguish between, in terms of individuation, the distinction that Simon Don makes between different kinds of individuation, where he says that once we get to the vital individuation, there is a capacity. This example with getting stabbed by a knife. Once you experience that, you interiorize it, and then of course from then on, you are anticipating or trying to avert. This is where immunology is born, because from now on you take into account the possibility this may or may not happen. So you're already operating on the future itself. But it seems to me when it comes to this idea of there has to be also a moment where we are not simply concerned about one's individual well-being, but operating together in this way of really embracing the possibility of doing something purposeless that may turn out to be really meaningful eventually. And it's not a coincidence that they produce what at first sight sounds like an oxymoron, the pragmatics of the purposeless. So pragmatics means you do it. You don't think it. You do it, and through doing, you can kind of provoke and not only do you actually engender something, but you also possibly trans-individuate, which is like which is something, a whole, an event that cannot be reduced to its constitutive elements, aka individuals. Stavros, you want to?
No, but in the line of stabbing Neil, which we will not, but
very bizarre moment.
Stabbing Neil, it's not, Neil carries with him the stab, not just in the sense of his memory. He's remembering or he's sensing still somehow all sorts of things, including including certainly an aversion towards me, let's say, after I've stabbed him. So it's not only about, let's say, carrying the past, it's also about whatever you are carrying, profoundly altering the so-called future. So obviously, were I to stab Neil, I don't expect that Neil would invite me again next year. So everything gets to be reshuffled. It's not just the past through the present, but it's also what can happen. In that way of thinking, basically that's genealogy. genealogical way of thinking. And I'm trying to respond to the question of the pressing problems that Gustavo mentioned. So in a genealogical way of thinking, you have something that happens. You can call that a datum, a given, like the day that I stabbed Neil, and you can have a precise calendar date, time date, all the facts in there, the room, the force, everything in there. If you open up to that other dimension, which is the dimension of potentials, so what Neil is carrying in his memory afterwards, but also what potentials are unleashed or blocked by the event, that's where genealogy is operating. And this, in a way, operates outside of a linear, closed understanding of time, which is one event after the other. You can start having events affecting other events in other spaces, in other times, which normally you wouldn't see them connected in any expected kind of way. When the Venetians were blocking off the Jewish population in one of the islands there, which might have happened for hygienic reasons then, which transform in cultural reasons later, which become financial reasons eventually. But nonetheless, they birth the concept of the ghetto. That ghetto can be then applied to any subsequent historical event, to any subsequent historical moment, in ways that have nothing to do with the initial conditions of its appearance, in ways that you can even push the ghetto in populations, people, cities, that have no cultural, financial, or hygienic reasons to be counter-effectuated by what was born in Venice 600 years ago. Why am I saying all these things? I think to find solutions, supposed solutions in quotes, for problems of the now, you can only experiment, as Andrej was saying, in that almost purposeless, in that almost useless, in that almost playful way, in figuring out what potentials are unleashed, what potentials are there, how can they do stuff to one another, and only by allowing this purposeless doing stuff to one another, it's almost sexual. We are saying that also in the book we're writing with Andrej. It's almost sexual in that sense of doing things to one another without any particular purpose in order for things to come out. That's a very broad definition of sex, and a very also how can I call it, non-human centered definition or animal centered definition of sex. And out of there, who knows what can come? I will finish now. That's also, even though he took a very strange turn, I think recently, but I'm not fully in agreement with, but Benjamin Bratton, who also has an architectural background, at least in his education, that's what he was saying in the book Terraforming when he was opening the book. He was saying that climate change as a thing, as a concept to begin with, which of course is a reality, all concepts are realities, as a concept is able to be produced only by the very same conditions that actually have climate change as an effect. So all our technologies that cause what we call climate change are the same technologies that allow us to conceptualize and identify that thing that we call climate change. Were we not able to screw up the planet to such degrees, we would not be able to have all the machinery needed and the technology needed in order to be able to even speak and monitor what we call climate change. So in simple terms, there's not one given solution. There's many given potentials for all sorts of unexpected chimes to come out.
And of course,
No, I was about to say thank you both. I think at the core, my question is, in the close readings that we're doing, they're looking at the nomad, and the nomad is contrary to the creation of the state, and there's a precursor. So there's an ebb and flow. They're the precursors, and they get close to the state, but then they move away from the state, and in that space, there is a creation. There is kind of this pulse, very similar to, the fly and the stripes. There is a state of creation. And I think you both are creating a space in my mind where I'm going, are you guys looking at the creation of a nomad, a new type of student? A new type of student that looks at this philosophy and goes, you know what? Even though I don't know how to solve this problem, I'll make it even more problematic. And that'll be a project. That'll be an investigation. And maybe from that, we can come up with different types of multiplicities of solutions. How are you thinking about, and maybe it's a new term for you, the nomad, or the type of new student that you're creating with this type of knowledge?
I think it's really appropriate. And if I'm not mistaken, at one point, Stavros was arguing for the encounter between the monad and the nomad. So the monadic and the nomadic coming together. And indeed, I think this is very well describes our pedagogical ambition, and I think it's about, in order to get there, I think the motto is one has to really start by explaining all the generalization, including the state. It's not the state as a category that can be in any way helpful in terms of explaining what is it that's happened, but how is it that we have arrived at that what we call the state. And I think in that sense, it really requires a lot of undoing, or starting from the opposite end, that is to say, not from the discrete, but from the continuous, in order to produce discrete that fits back into the continuous, and so, and voila. You are keen on saying something?
I'm not so sure about starting from a continuous to end to a discrete or vice versa. I think, yeah, we said not pick sides, not two sides, but I think what is important is that, I mean, there is a reason why Andrej and I are first and foremost, we are architects, and I'm not willing to hide that. So we come from architecture to all these discussions, not from another domain, to speak metaphorically about how they apply in architecture. And one thing that makes architects very, I'm not liking the term, but let's use it. One thing that makes architects blessed when it comes to speaking about things like that is that one way or another, they have gotten their hands, again, metaphorically speaking, they've gotten their hands dirty in making stuff, in doing things. When you do things, you know that things do not operate in a way that's precisely the one you read in the books alone, or that's precisely the one that you read when they're done already. Or you see when they're done already. So you know that the end product and the process of making, there is both some continuity and some discreteness implied in the process and the end product. And I think that this is something that you can apply as well to ideas, or you can apply to concepts, or you can apply to philosophy that you are reading. So there is a reason why we both, Andrej and I, as architects, entering in discussing things that operate also outside of architecture. There is a reason why we like Deleuze. There's a reason why we like Guattari, why we like Stigler, why we like Simondon, Bergson, Leibniz, Spinoza, Giordano Bruno, the Stoics, you name it. Bring as many as you want in there. Simondon, obviously. It's because all these thinkers are thinking about the genetic rather than the generic. So they're thinking about the process of production rather than the end fixed product alone. None of them is saying that we need to get rid of the end product. So none of them is saying that the end product is an illusion or it doesn't matter. Of course it matters. That's why we insist on the discreteness as well. That's why we insist on the importance, let's say, of concepts. A concept is something that is produced. How can you speak about it, however, if you don't know how it has been produced? The same way that you could not be, as an architect, you would not be able to say anything about any building if you were not aware of how that building was designed, by whom, what were the reasons, what were the clients, why there were delays, why there were no delays. All these things are genetic elements in the making of a building. As architects, we know that. And this attitude, this genetic attitude, the attitude that prioritizes the genesis over the end product in the process of examining it, is one that I think overspills from architecture. It overspills to all sorts of, let's say, other interests. It's an environmental way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking that, I'm not saying it because I suspect it. I know it for a fact. Andrej knows for a fact. Many philosopher friends of ours are lacking it, and they admit that they are lacking it. It's not that we are assuming it. They admit that they are lacking this environmental groundedness, let's say, that makes concepts, even concepts as eternal as God, for example, even concepts as eternal as justice, even concepts as eternal as climate. Climate is a concept as well, a super eternal one. Gravity is a concept, also a rather eternal one. You have to figure out how it was made. So you have to figure out how gravity was made if you wanna speak about gravity. And that's why I mentioned it in a passing. Newton or Einstein, they had different ideas about genetic ideas about gravity. They didn't just come up with a definition. Each one of them had radically different genetic ideas about how gravity operates. It's not about ending up with a fixed essence and just staying with it as opposed to be going in a big bag of knowledge that you're just adding things. It's about you yourself, body and spirit, whatever these two might be, occupying all the points, all the transformations, all the series that can help you figure out the thing that you are interested in. How was it produced? I'm stopping now the monologue with one last sentence. The only way to do that, before you end up, as Deleuze was also saying, as quickly as possible to the eternal concept of God, let's say, the only way to do that is to figure out how you can start from your own experience. So, I mean, pedagogically speaking, what Andrej and I, we are suggesting to all students of all levels, start from your own experience. You want to examine God, you want to examine beauty, you want to examine, you name it, climate change. Start from your own experience. You cannot speak of climate change or be bothered with it without finding first and foremost your own experiential definition of change. So think, when did you change? How did you change? Where did you change? What was that thing that you consider, this moment I am not longer the same as I was before? If you figure out change on that level experientially with the intensity that it comes from you, then you can start taking it over, carrying it over, including it with you in all other interests and enterprises.
Can I just jump in there, Stavros? Because there's one thing that I've been struggling with myself over the last few months or so, a few weeks or so. That is the definition, understanding of intelligence. I mean, you gave us one particular understanding of intelligence. One of the things that I've come across is the notion that intelligence is all about prediction, both in the world of AI and also in the world in terms of neuroscience, in the sense that, what does ChatGPT do? But it just predicts the next token, and out of that, miraculously, we get something that makes sense, complete sense. And according to people like Carl Friston, and it goes back further than that as well. But that's what intelligence is about, being able to predict in order to not be surprised by what's going to come next. So so it's all based. So one is based on data and predicting the future. Another one's based on experience and then predicting the future. I've had a stab from you, Stavros. I know from the not to be careful about whatever, and that is, and there's a kind of harmony in that, which is kind of interesting. And I don't know if it relates to your kind of configuration of harmony, in the sense that you're not surprised because you've modeled the world enough that nothing comes as a surprise. Does prediction figure in your notion of intelligence at all? Yeah.
Andrej, you want to give a go? And
very, very quickly, I have had that chance to talk about this with Neil. I will just reiterate. It seems to me that this is where it becomes helpful to distinguish between the instinct, as Bergson does, intuition, and intelligence, because instinct is that thing that you do, as it were. I mean, clearly, that's something that you cannot not do. I mean, you are threatened, you have to run. You're hungry, you have to eat. You're aroused, you have to have sex and things like this. I think when it comes to intelligence, from Bergsonian point of view, it's as organic as it is social. It is social, and I think it's a good example of this stubbing, because it becomes like brings the two of you together, and there's something that can be then anticipated and avoided if necessary. And that's why I think we have to include and not dismiss because the first one is about immediate gratification. I mean, you thirsty, you quench your thirst by drinking water. The second one is slightly deferred, because this space that opens between you being stopped and figuring out how to avoid it next time around, it is, to my mind, it brings, it's very similar to building a house. Instead of like every single time look for an appropriate tree to protect you from the elements, we invest some time, and so the gratification is deferred. But the intuition is really disinterested, and I think this is something I think we can automize to a certain extent the first two, if I can speculate freely here. But the intuition is that which is precisely because it's disinterested. It really has no goal, and so what does it predict? There's nothing to predict, because it doesn't. The future is not. It's completely open, like radically open, and of course it is not completely non-deterministic, because there are path dependencies. Certain things are more likely to happen or not. But I think when Leibniz proposes that it's both about the mechanicism and vitalism, that it's both about the push and the efficient cause, but it's as much about the value, what he calls the soul. Then this mechanism becomes so complicated that it really takes into account the earlier Stavros referred to the transduction, where things fall out of phase with themselves. So it is impossible to predict what might happen, because by the time you predict, the adjacent possible, to use Stuart Kaufman terms, or to use associated milieu of Simon Don is transformed. And my go-to example, and I apologize, I can't resist, because I think it's really beautiful. When Guattari in one of his books, he recounts this episode of an octopus being in French TV, live television. He takes it from its habitat and puts it in a clean bowl with clean water, and the octopus dies immediately, because by the time we have managed to pollute the water, the organism itself has adopted that now the clean water is lethal. So to me, like it seems to me that if we take seriously the idea of transduction and falling out of phase with itself, and the ratcheting machine that from the efficient cause produces the final cause, and the final cause determines how the efficient cause might work, and it spins and spins. It is we can never ever again refer to the future as something that can be predicted.
I don't want to say I disagree with Andrej, because I rarely do, but I agree. But I disagree in a pragmatic way that the future can be predicted. However, it's not a future anymore in the sense of being radically opened. It's a continuation of the existing, let's say, givens of the present. So it's also the two different definitions of intelligence. If one of them is the prediction one, that implies also specific understanding of time when you are thinking of intelligence as prediction. If you acknowledge another understanding of time, as Andrej was implying, one where time is open, then next to an intelligent prediction, you also need an intelligent purposelessness. What do I mean by that? I mean, there's nothing purposeful in not to go to current examples. Let's go all the way to the beginning. In the cavemen painting on the caves, could we define that as intelligence? And if we would define it as one of the initial signs of, let's say, human intelligence, which are going beyond instinct, or even a step beyond some not immediate but postponed gratification, because, let's say, a very primitive tool to make some fire, it's also a sign of intelligence, in the sense, yeah, of course, you want to warm up yourself. You don't just jump into a volcano or into a natural source of fire. You produce the tools. That's intelligent. You produce the tools in order to be able to create your own fires. But what about these extra levels of intelligence that are expressed when you're painting into the cave? When you're doing that painting into the cave, what is to be predicted in there? What is the purpose of painting in a cave? You might say that the purpose is that, yeah, a mysticist almost understanding of the world, where you're starting to create connections between things that are supposed outside of your control. You can say that notions as God are produced in there. That's the way that you can communicate with the gods. What is exactly purposeful, and what, given factum of the, let's say, the life of the caveman pre-painting, could have predicted that the cavemen, you know what they're going to do next? They're going to start painting on the caves. However, this unpredicted, totally useless in any pragmatic optimization-based sense, I would claim, Stigler claims, that is the thing that produces the humans, because it's the first proto-language that allows for our thoughts to be more than just our tools, to be more than just our companions, to stay inscribed for other cavemen, for our children, for the children of our children, and see them there. So the problem with the current understanding of AI as so much attuned with no play, because that's more or less it. I know that Neil is busy with playing with it, so Neil already is doing a different take on AI somehow than the canonical. But already, I mean, the imposed understanding of AI as this mega optimization tool is basically running the risk of taking us in a pre-cave painting situation, where everything is about using technology to gratify our needs. It's not about that. It's about creating needs we don't know we know, and we don't know we want. It's about creating gods. I mean, Bergson, one of his most controversial, let's say, lines was that the universe is a machine, so already technological, for the making of gods. That's what he was saying, that we use machines in this cosmos to make gods. And by gods, you can put values instead of gods. So we're using machines not just to gratify slowly or fastly our instincts, but we are using machines, we're having machines to produce values. And values are non-predictable. The question for me would be, in the current technological paradigm of AI, let's say, which is also a simplification to call it AI, but let's say in the current paradigm of AI, how can you use it to paint the caves, the metaphorical painting of the metaphorical caves? So how could you be purposeless with AI? How could you play with AI? That would be the most important factor to open up, rather than to use it to optimize knowledge, to optimize bombing, as is happening recently, to optimize any sort of logistics. How can you play with it? If we can figure that out in a way that escapes the canonical, commercialized, let's say, ways of doing it, then we can start doing with it, thinking with it, producing gods with it, rather than just falling into the algorithmic governmentality, as Rouvroy or Zubov are explaining and describing it.
Because they said effectively they're predicting the past for as long as you're just extrapolating. And that's the mechanicism again, because there is no teleology there.
I don't know. The thing is, okay, but we get going down a few more rabbit holes.
Yeah.
But I think, wasn't it Freud who's kind of made the comment that the painting on the cave was, of a bison or whatever, an animal, was a kind of wish fulfillment. That was wanted to go and capture or something. And I do think there is a difference between the way that computation works, or AI works, which is to do a world devoid of meaning, and the way that we construct meaning. And I think therefore, I think religion comes out of, to my mind, of this meaning-making machines that are human beings. And I find this a kind of curious aspect of what we talk about today. Where does religion fit in? But as soon as we go down there, we really are opening up a can of worms. Anyway, I think we should try and wrap this up, because we've 2.5 hour mark, but just to thank Andrej and Stavros for their, I do think of you as a Deleuze and Guattari of architectural culture today. And I think that it's a very productive, an argument for the rhizome in itself, the way that you guys operate together. And I'm envious of the culture that you've got that's going on there. Fantastic. And just to mention, just to kind of say that of course, the German philosopher who died yesterday, we should just mention Habermas, intersubjective rationality. It kind of resonates with today, even though it's very different as well at the same time. But thank you so much. This is really, I think, a fabulous ongoing collaboration, less stabbing and more something else. But anyway, it's and I just want to thank you also Asmara, who's been behind the posters and live stream today, part also the Greek Mafia, and the whole Futures community. Next week we're going to carry on. We're going to follow up with the crisis. What crisis? Question about the supposed demise of architectural theory, or what. And I'm also hoping that maybe the next year we'll be able to invite Andrej and Stavros to take part in that as well, because I can think of no better kind of commentators than you guys in Delft. So anyway, so
thank you, Neil. Thank you, Neil.
Very kind of you. Thank you. Very generous. It's a real pleasure.
I really think that, one of the things I just, when we first started doing this, was this notion that we could get a kind of global brain. In other words, thinking together. And I think it's precisely what we're beginning to sort of establish here. So thanks again for the contribution.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you so much. Greetings,
everyone. Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Bye.
Istanbul.
Hello.
Hope to see you. Thank you.